Kabbalah means to receive. It means receptivity. So think of someone telling you a joke, okay? And you don't really get it. And then, oh yeah, that was symbolic. That was metaphor. Oh, I get it.
So E comes up in the context of exponential growth. So I think the simplest thing for describing exponential growth is that you could imagine something that doubles at a certain frequency. So like maybe you start with one thing, and then after a certain amount of time it becomes 2, after a certain amount of time it becomes 4, after a certain amount of time it becomes 8. Those types of formulas, you can imagine instead of doubling every time, it triples every time, or it quadruples every time, or so on. E turns out to be the most natural number to use. So instead of doubling or tripling, it multiplies by E every time. And when if you have exponential growth that follows that kind of a trajectory, the rate of change is always equal to the amount that there is. So a quantity will always be growing by the same amount that it actually is. So that's E.
Pei and Fei. Pei and Fei, interestingly, they feel a little different to me, even though I've been saying they're the same. The Sophiot and the ending letters and the medial ones are, I kind of look at them as the same essential meaning. It feels to me like the pei with the dot in it has to do with parting, separating. It also has to do with the mouth, pa, articulating. It's a stronger sound than the fei. And so the fei I consider a little bit more literally flighty. There's a pei in the word for bird. There's a fei in the word for hover and fly. So I'm wondering if maybe the fei and then the final fei is teaching us something about fluttering that's somehow grounded. I don't know. I'd have to think about it more, but that was my initial thought, that it has something to do with flight.
Lilith is another very interesting figure in mythology and in astrology. Astrologically speaking, Lilith refers to the lunar apogee, which is the farthest point that the moon reaches in its orbit. And because of this, at that time, the moon visually appears smaller in the sky than it ever does. Now, the moon is, famously associated through all of antiquity into the modern day with, the feminine principle, right? It rules over the menstrual period, the gestation cycle. It has a lot to do with the principle of motherhood and of this nurturing quality that we all possess. Now, because Lilith is associated with the lunar apogee, when the moon is at its smallest, it's really kind of the antithesis of this. And the mythology behind Lilith has almost been erased from its original standing, which was, it's discussed in Kabbalistic texts, but it's pretty much been erased from the original Christian doctrine, which is that she was really the original woman. She was the original woman given to Adam. She was not made of Adam. She was not made of his rib. She was made of dust and the dirt of earth, just like Adam was. And the story goes that they were placed in the Garden of Eden and asked to procreate. And Adam told Lilith to lie under him, and she refused. And she defied him because she believed them to be equals. And she said, "No, I will not lay under you. We are equals." And because of this, Adam went to God and said, "My wife defies me. I cannot control her. Please give me a new wife." and Lilith ran away. She was visited by a few angels who told her that she will have to witness 100 of her children dying a day if she is not to return to Adam and obey him as her husband. And yet she still chose to defy the word of God and chose her freedom and independence and sexual sanctity and power really over her husband. And so Lilith in astrology and in mythology represents the defiance of women against the patriarchy and the sanctity of female power and sexual prowess. And you can even see this in the symbol that is given to Lilith. Her glyph is a crescent moon, which represents the female principle, stapled to a cross. So a lot of what Lilith represents is, kind of the societal, this is a very dramatic way of putting it, but kind of the societal crucifixion of women and female power.
A practical application. I mean, the thing is that it just appears in all the formulas for exponential growth. And everything grows exponentially. Like if you have money in a bank account, it grows exponentially. The GDP should, in principle, grow exponentially. When you're, describing the cost of things, that rise due to inflation, that's an exponential growth. And so you'll see that. And then on the other hand, there's exponential decay that happens, like where things decrease by in an exponential way, and that can also be like there's in the physical world, there's nuclear particles will decay at a rate that's exponential. If you have a drug that's in your body, it'll decay at a rate that's exponential, the amount that's there. I think about that when I'm drinking coffee.
Interesting character in mythology and in astrology. He's most commonly referred to as the wounded healer. The story about Chiron is that, again, he was born of two different creatures, one being the god Kronos, or Saturn, and the other being a nymph. Now, Kronos was pursuing this nymph, and she converted herself into a mare, or a horse, in order to avoid him. He also converted himself into a horse, and because of this, Chiron, was born as half man, half horse. But because of his godly nature, he was not like all of the other centaurs who were known to be very aggressive and brash and unruly. He kind of transcended, once again, this more animalistic nature and went on to be highly educated. He was given to the god Apollo for education and learned in the arts of war, medicine, herbal medicine, philosophy, astrology, divination, and he ended up being regarded one of the wisest minds in all of the ancient world. And he went on to be the teacher and educator to heroes. The most commonly known are going to be Jason of the Argonauts. He was also the teacher of Heracles or Hercules, of Achilles himself. And he was regarded as, one of the most brilliant minds of his time. And basically every modality that you can think of.
So pi is, if you have a circle, you can measure a circle by its diameter, and you can also measure a circle by its circumference. And pi is the ratio. If you take the circumference and you divide the diameter, that you'll always get pi. So anytime you're studying circles, pi will be there as part of the formula. But also, anytime you have oscillations that are occurring, a circle, if you imagine going around a circle, it's like an oscillatory motion. And anytime you're describing oscillations, pi will appear in that formula. So in particular, if you have waves, like if you pluck a guitar string and you want to describe the formula for how the string oscillates, the pi will appear in that formula. So like a practical application for that is that we all listen to music nowadays on our computers and our phones, and in order to translate the information of the actual wave, that's a sound wave, into a digital format, they'll use formulas that involve pi to describe that.
We can do tsadi. Tsadi is one that I hadn't thought about a lot, but when I did meditate on it a little bit, I got the insight that the tsadi itself, I mean, tsadi, its shape is divergent, and it's in the word for spark, it's in the word for fringe and tassel, explosion. So you get the general sense of tsadi is like a diffusion, right? And that is its shape. But the final tsadi is a little bit more grounded. So it's diffusion that's grounded. And interestingly enough, eitz, the Hebrew word for tree, is formed with a final tsadi. If you write the word eitz, that's an ayin and a tsadi, and just write it very simple, but let them touch up to each other, it looks exactly like a tree. It's quite interesting. So the idea that perhaps the longer letters, that their form grounds something, that the ones that are long, the final forms that are extra long, it's most of them, that it gave me the idea that the long forms somehow ground the general essence of that word. Because a tree really is still diffuse, but it has roots.
And the story goes that because Chiron was born of two godly creatures, he was immortal. Now, he was in a battle one day and was shot in the ankle with a poisoned arrow. And because he was immortal, he could not die from this poison, but he was doomed to live out the rest of, eternity in suffering and in pain. And in his attempt to heal himself, he essentially traveled through the world and all of the different civilizations that had modern forms of medicine, trying to find a cure for his pain and suffering. And alas, he was not able to do so. So he returned back to ancient Greece at the time and taught a few more people in the arts of what he knew. One of those people was actually Asclepius himself, or Ophiuchus. And the story goes that eventually it came to a point where Chiron decided that he would like to end his life. He couldn't deal with the suffering anymore. However, because he was immortal, he had to kind of find a way around this problem, and the story goes that Prometheus was a mortal who had brought fire from the gods to humans and was being punished for that. And he had been chained to a rock in the center of the earth, where he was doomed for the rest of eternity to have his liver eaten by an eagle every single day. It would regenerate, and once again, it would be eaten. And eventually, Chiron decided that he would offer himself up and trade places with Prometheus, granting him his freedom while relinquishing his immortality. And in doing so, he was finally able to bring about his death and the end of his suffering. Because of this, Chiron in astrology, it's an asteroid that is present in natal charts and transits and predictions, and it's oftentimes seen as the mortal wound in somebody, a wound that we might not be able to overcome in our lifetime, but through our pain and suffering, we are able to bring about transcendence in others.
So what is a chaf all about? The medial forms refer to the palm. That's what a chaf and a kaf look like. And then the final form has the same kind of head, and then it just drops all the way down instead of continuing. So is that another time when there's this idea of containment, but it's more grounded? I'm not really sure, but that's how I would tend to work with it, just in terms of the shape of the letters and where they appear. So that's really it. I mean, I could say a little bit more about the roundness of the chaf and the words that it appears in, but well, the chaf, which has that round form, people are familiar with the word kippah, that's pretty much what it looks like. This in Hebrew is called clapping kapayim. It means two kafs, yeah. And I wonder if the word circumference has an etymology that might be related to the kaf, not necessarily the final form. We're talking about the round form there, but the final form is different. Of course, it appears only at the end.
Okay. So the Fibonacci numbers, the way that they're defined is that you start with 1 and 1, and then you get the next number by adding the two numbers that came before it. So 1 plus 1 is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, 2 plus 3 is 5, 3 plus 5 is 8, and so on. And if you take the ratio of one Fibonacci number divided by the one that came before it, you'll get a number that is close to the golden ratio. So 5 over 3 is, 1.66. 8 over 5 is 1.6. 13 is the next one, so 13 over 8 is like 1.625. And the golden ratio is pretty close to that, like somewhere around 1.6. And it's supposed to describe ratios that are aesthetically pleasing, like in terms of height. Like if you have something where the height of an object in relation to the width of an object is about the golden ratio, then it's an aesthetically pleasing ratio to see.
Chaf is like the pei, where you have, the kaf can have a dot, it cannot have a dot, it can have the final form, which is lengthened. And then that final form that's lengthened, that can be in the root, like in the word for blessing, baruch. The final form is in the root. But chaf also has a lot of other jobs, mostly holding on to, we would call it a nominal suffix. It's a suffix that we attach onto a Hebrew word so we know who's doing the action. If he or she is doing the action. The chaf is a nominal suffix, and that means it lets us know who's doing the action. If you, a male, or you, a female, are doing the action, there's going to be a chaf there to indicate that. So Torah is the word for Torah, our book of learning, and Torah Techa is your Torah. So there's a chaf doing that grammatical function. None of the other letters that we're looking at do that grammatical function. Cut that out. It's not true. Nun and mem also can have a grammatical function.
Demeter, or Ceres, is the mother of Persephone, and her story is really a story of grief and loss, because as myth has it, Persephone was a very beautiful young girl, and she was roaming the fields one day, and Hades, god of the underworld, saw her, and he decided that he wanted her as his bride. And because of this, he came up from the underworld and essentially abducted her and brought her back down with him to rule the underworld as his queen. And Ceres, or Demeter, in her rage, threatened the gods to kill all of the crops and bring famine to the world if her daughter was not returned to her. Now, unfortunately, while Persephone was in the underworld, she ate seeds from the pomegranate, which is the fruit of the underworld, and was said to essentially bind you to that realm for all of eternity. So a bargain was struck where Persephone was able to be with her mother during the spring, and because of this, Ceres, or Demeter, allows abundance and, fertile land to flourish, and we have the blossoming of spring and the abundance of life in spring and summer And then come fall, during the time of the equinox, it said that Persephone had to return to the underworld, and there Ceres, or Demeter, removes all life from the world and kills everything in her sight. And because of this, in our lives and in astrology, Ceres, or Demeter, really kind of represents both this idea of female rage and the power behind that, and also grief and loss and the bittersweet elements of both, the existence of life and the existence of death, and this polarity that exists within all of us.
It actually does tend to be in terms of the relationship with the Fibonacci numbers. I teach number theory and combinatorics classes, and in these classes we'll study the Fibonacci numbers. There are lots of ways that they appear. So actually, historically speaking, the first place that the Fibonacci numbers were studied was in the context of studying Sanskrit poetry. And the syllables there are long syllables and there are short syllables. And if you study like how many different patterns there are of a certain length, where you can have some combination of long syllables and short syllables, it turns out that the number of patterns is always a Fibonacci number.
Literally, we say that the alphabet, that the uttering of the Creator is what made the world come into being.
So Ophiuchus is most commonly referred to as the 13th sign of the zodiac, but it refers to a constellation that sits at the very tail end of Scorpio and the beginning of Sagittarius. Ophiuchus is associated with the mythology of Asclepius. Asclepius was a son of the god Apollo, and he was half god, half mortal. His mother was mortal, and he was abandoned by both his mother and father, left as an orphan, and was given to Chiron, actually, the centaur, to be raised and educated. He ended up being educated as a healer and was taught in the ways of herbal medicine and even, as myth says, some modern medical practices such as surgery and the like. And he ended up being regarded as a demigod of modern medicine and went on to be an extremely gifted healer, even more gifted, myth says, than his own father, Apollo, who was the original god of the healing arts. The story, however, of Asclepius and Ophiuchus is really a story of transcendence, of death itself, and kind of the rat race that is human existence and life, because, as the story goes, Asclepius ended up becoming so adept at healing that he was able to bring the dead back from the underworld and bring them back to life. And after his initial experimentation with resurrection, it was determined that he had essentially broken natural law and needed to be put to death. And because of this, his grandfather, Zeus, or Jupiter, was tasked with the responsibility of executing his grandson, Asclepius, Ophiuchus, and he was cast into the sky following his death as the constellation Ophiuchus.
There are lots of different ways to think about infinity. You can imagine just counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you never stop. And somewhere in that horizon at the end is infinity, and you never quite get there, but it's there. But for me, I'm actually a geometer, and so infinity can appear in a geometric context where you imagine that you have the number line that has all of the numbers, and at one end there's a positive infinity, and at the other end there's a negative infinity, and those, if you throw in those points, it sort of closes off the number line so that instead of going off forever, there's like an endpoint. And so then it allows you to view the number line in a way that's as if it's finite, where it has an end, one end is positive infinity and the other end is negative infinity. There are other contexts where instead of having a positive infinity and a negative infinity that are different, you treat them as being the same, and then it has the effect of sort of closing off the number line and making it look more like a circle. This point is the same thing as this point, and so it's like they're tied up together to make a circle.
I love Nun. Nun is actually really amazing. It's, as you know, it has two forms. So we have what's called the long Nun, and then we have the Nun that marks a little bit of an upturn. In Kabbalistic thought, the upturn is an indicator to us that there's a return trip. So the long Nun represents the flow from the higher realm, interpenetrating into this realm. And that's a very important concept in Jewish life, that we're meant to integrate the higher into this world. And then the non-final Nun is an indication of another very important concept, and that is it's our job as the receivers of this flow to turn the materials of this world back into the higher.
Ophiuchus is known as the 13th sign, and there's a group of astrologers who do include this sign in their delineations and in their predictions. However, in the general esoteric diaspora, Ophiuchus is really seen as kind of this sign of transcendence. It's a constellation that sits above both Scorpio and Sagittarius, Scorpio being a sign and an archetype associated with the most primal and animalistic parts of human nature. And because of this, it's associated with crisis and kind of the crisis and pain that can come about by these more animal sides of human existence and consciousness. Whereas on the other side of Ophiuchus Sagittarius is the representation of higher knowledge, a broader perspective on life itself, and a transcendence of this animal nature. Ophiuchus, sitting between the two of them, represents the observer of both these aspects of human existence. And because of this, in my opinion, I don't know that it's necessarily part of the zodiacal wheel, rather kind of an escape from it, an observer of the dichotomy that is, human existence.
In my number theory class recently, we were talking about a point at infinity that appears when you're studying curves. And we would have a curve, and we would draw a line through the curve, and we would look at the intersection points of the line through the curve. And sometimes you would have vertical lines that didn't have as many intersection points as you would expect them to have. And we would say that instead there was another intersection point at infinity. And these types of curves, they're called elliptic curves. They come up in cryptography.
Can I give you a funny example? Okay. The example I like to give for how it is that we raise things into the higher is that we can change soil into blessing. How do we change soil into blessing? Well, soil is a producer of plants. Plants grow. We transform them into meals. We transform them into ritual objects such as the talus. So we transform the soil into the food product, then into the product that we're actually eating. And before we take that in, we stop for a moment and pause, make a vertical connection, and bless, so that all that materiality is now lifted in a way. And it's a simple idea, but I do think that's the best way to talk about how Jewish people see our role here. It's very instructive, the Nun. is Andrea Cohen-Kiner. I was ordained as a rabbi in the year 2000, and I was trained as a Hebrew educator before I ordained as a rabbi, and I've had a long-standing interest in linguistics.
I'm Rajan Mehta. I'm a math professor at Smith College. I studied geometry and mathematical physics.
Hi, my name is Sarah France. I am an astrologer, mystic, occultist, and I'm the owner of Solar Cross Astrology. I've dedicated my life to the practice and study of astrological divination and the healing potential that can come from understanding our karmic blueprint and our purpose of incarnation here on Earth.
So there's this idea that the out-breath and the different forms and shapes of the letters, different sounds that are possible, really concretize as they emanate away from Creator and make shapes and forms they weave into what eventually becomes material.
There are a lot of times in my classes where I end up talking about the historical trajectory of numbers. I'll talk about how people started by counting, and they're just counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and then at some point they realize that they need to have 0, because what if you don't have anything?
My extent to the understanding of the Kabbalah is the story of Lilith.
Jewish magic tradition, which I do not really study or practice, would hold that if we understand the potency of the letters of creation, that we can alter creation.
And then there's also imaginary numbers. So sometimes I'll teach complex analysis where we have to talk about imaginary numbers, because there is no square root of -1, for example, and so you throw that in.
Yeah, I would say that this path chose me.